Okay, we're gonna see how good my drawing skill is with this quality keyboard, or mouse rather, that I really can't make move at all. This is a circle! Trust me.
98 points. Wonderful. Subarashi wan. Great.
I'm gonna have to screw one of these lessons up so that we get a message other than wonderful, great. I want to see whether they say, you know, you're terrible, you're awful, or they say, try harder next time.
Yep. Ojiki. I think that's bow. I think that's what he's doing. Oh, Ojigi. Yes, it's bow.
Yeah, looks bad. Again, really creepy look to the forearms.
これからも元気に挨拶するワン. So from now on, from here on, I'll be doing really energetic greetings. Aisatsu is greeting, but I guess it can also mean like set phrases, social phrases in this case. Yeah.
I don't recognize this breed of dog.
The shepherd dog from Abe, that's all I know. Hello, Poach. Konnichiwa. Yeah, saying hello, literally English hello. Hello,
and his eyes stare into your soul.
Why don't we go to the park and play? Let's have a long conversation, or let's talk a lot, rather.
Now... Oh, that'll just be typing lessons. Okay, whoa, okay. When you said long conversation, I'm going to intentionally screw this up a lot. I want to see the dog be disappointed at me.
Sure. This at the top, by the way, says border collie, and the text you're failing at is chopini samishi, which is I'm a little bit lonely.
It's actually kind of difficult to screw up because it waits for you to type the right thing. So I'm just gonna every other character throw something irrelevant in there. Actually, I'll just use the number 1 because that'll be definitely wrong.
Of course. Because I felt like it. I'm not sure how to translate that.
Three N's in a row.
Kyo wa today. And like the start of a sentence today.
Right. All right.
Osampo biyori ne. Biyori, hiyori. I can't remember. It's something about a walk. Oh, it's a nice weather for a walk.
You have more time to translate thanks to my intentionally typing as badly as humanly possible.
Exactly. Kirei no yofuku mo. Those are nice clothes. Yofuku specifically is Western clothes, but it's what everyone wears, so we just say clothes. Daisuki yo, love you.
I'm so good at typing. Look, every other character I type something irrelevant, but other than that, I'm really good at it.
Iko nano ne. Good boy. Good dog, good boy.
Right. These are just, common phrases you use in speech. By the way, in this world, everyone is a dog, so this is going to be a pretty common phrase.
Right. Oh, hanabatake de. Hanabatake. Oh, field of flowers. Oh, in a field of flowers. Oh, hanabatake de. Sobitaina. Oh, sobitaina. I want to play. And you're awful. You're awful.
If I just move around my hands at random, eventually, by sheer coincidence, I will hit the right key.
Something about monkeys and typewriters in Shakespeare.
Yeah, exactly. Except this monkey on this typewriter has the advantage that it only actually accepts the correct key. So.
Right. Sampo de. A walk. Sampo is a walk outside.
Again, very, very dog-specific words.
Generally. On Sunday.
No other walking days allowed.
Nope, just Sunday. Hareru to ina. It'll be nice if it's sunny. I guess with the previous one, it's a sentence. It'll be nice if it's sunny on Sunday. Yama e ikitai wa. I want to go to the mountains.
I'm hoping that I have typed enough trash that it'll give me an unhappy score, even though I am now too lazy to type wrongly.
Yeah, you shall see.
So, I think we're actually forming, like, maybe not one long sentence, but maybe, like, one long conversation, essentially.
Kind of. They're all, like, bits of sentences. Like, they're words followed by, particles, which give the meaning of the word within the context of the sentence.
Yeah.
So, yeah, they're like parts of sentences, which could be strung together to form something. So announcing the results.
Oh no! Game over!
あと一息だわ. Take a break after this.
It's too bad there's no Japanese way to express the concept game over, so they had to resort to English.
また頑張るわ. I'll try hard next time.
Now, will it allow me to continue from here, or is it going to be like, you must go to the start?
Question.
Oh, dear God, no! Luckily, there's this...
Looks like you're back to the start.
Luckily, there's this skip option, so...
Yeah. Want to go to the mountain? Me too, me too.
I want a bigger keyboard.
Well, too bad.
It's not great. So, like, I guess I don't know in terms of typing lessons, but, like, when learning the piano, like, ill-informed parents will go, oh, I'll buy one of those kiddie pianos, but then children learn, like, the wrong spacing between keys, and even though their hands are going to grow, it's not like the muscle memory grows with the hands. That's not how it works. So it's terrible to teach kids, like, on an undersized piano keyboard, and I assume it's not a good idea to teach them on an undersized computer keyboard either.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I would agree.
%. Suddenly you don't suck. The dog is singing. The dog is singing. the dog appears to be singing. Wave.
Coach learned bye-bye.
Oh, well, you could call it wave, but okay, let's call it bye-bye, whatever. Why use any native words when we can import them from English?
That was fun. I just got the one.
Now that feels a lot like that was the last lesson. Or not.
Or not.
Hi, Lassie. What's up?
Hey.
Konnichiwa. That dog looked vaguely like Lassie from the side, not so much from the front. Definitely not.
Well, he's saying let's go something. Just the yote I'm not sure of. Let's have a bro conversation. Let's have a conversation between guys. Both guys, let's conversate about that.
Let's talk about male things. No girly words allowed.
Yeah, this is definitely more rough male speech. I guess that's what he's getting at here.
So this is like we've switched registers a little bit.
Yes. I don't know some of these. Hinatoboko is relaxing in the sun. Interesting. Ii tenki da na. Yeah, this is nice. This is nice weather.
Nothing could be more, rough male sort of locker room talk than let's relax in the sun. I remember, so one of my most popular videos on my channel is, Mavis Beacon Teaches Typing, and there's some really obscure words in there, because it's less about, I'm gonna tell you a story through what I'm saying, and more like, well, you need to learn to adapt while typing, and so it uses fairly obscure. Wow, how many dogs can be taught? Like this is Westminster Dog Show grade tricks here.
Yep. And they are skilled, yeah. Maware is, spin is how you translate it, but I guess
flip for a dog trick, yeah.
Yeah. Doshi no himitsu da. It's a secret between men. Otoko doshi means like, or onna doshi means like the if you have two people and they're the same, like otoko doshi, it's they're all guys, or onna doshi, it's all women.
Yeah. So it's a secret between our class. Only men are allowed to backflip.
Yeah, it's like a boys only thing. This is a secret for boys only.
Yeah. Mind you, I'm using the Hello Kitty mouse for this computer right now, so
right.
Don't tell the computer.
Konnichiwa. I have no idea what. I mean, I recognize the style. I don't know what it's called though.
I don't think dogs have blue eyes. That's creeping me out. If
you want to be a good dog, a great dog, you must study. Yeah, great. I'll teach you words that will be useful.
%. Good for me. I wonder what incredibly difficult skill our dog is going to learn now.
Hanse is like respect. Turn down.
What is he doing?
Oh no, meditation. He's meditating.
We've taught our dog to, I mean, he speaks Japanese, so again, we're underestimating.
I'm actually not sure. Hansei, I'm not really familiar with. The dictionary says the primary meaning is reflection, reconsideration, meditation, contemplation. Secondary meaning is regret, repentance, being sorry. So take your pick.
I mean, if you imagine a wall, like the paw is up against a wall, then what this dog is doing is having an existential crisis. Why are we teaching a dog to have an existential crisis?
Why not?
I mean, again, the dog speaks Japanese.
Kashikunata kibun da wa. Kashikokunata is like kashikoi, become smart, clever. He feels like I feel like I've become more smart, more clever.
And now I can think about life.
Right?
This is a big dog. How many levels could there possibly be?
How many types of dogs are there? Yeah, konnichiwa. Just go to the whole list. Omoshiroi hanashi wo kiitan ja. I want to ask you something interesting. Or I was asked something interesting. Jugemu teyu negai namae wo shiteiru kai? Do you know the long name called Jugame? And the only thing in dictionary for Jugame is the Lakitu brothers from Mario, unless it's like German or something. I don't know. Let's see if there's a theme. That's weird. Long name. Jugame.
The long name is just the word said twice.
I asked my wife, who's Japanese. Apparently, there's like a joke, I guess. It's a very long name, like he said, and she just quoted the whole thing. And like, and she went on for like a minute. Like, I can't even remember half the words she said. But apparently, like, these are all like auspicious, lucky things. So like it's kind of a joke, or like almost like a Monty Python-esque joke. Like, what do you want to name your baby? Oh, it's something really happy, like Jigemu, Jigemu, a really, really long name.
I see.
I'm guessing all of these words are part of that joke, which until now I had.
Okay. Which probably is the kind of thing that is not sufficiently important in Japanese that you would learn it when learning Japanese, but if you grew up in Japan is a joke you would be aware of. And yet I got 99%. And RSI. I get them both at the same time.
Fabulous. Banzai. Yeah, there's a banzai.
Yeah, that looks celebratory. I can agree.
Yep. I learned a bunch of words. Yeah, you did.
Well, kinda.
Beagle, like symbols, codes, like not actual characters. And then to the right is emoji. Emoji was the thing in Japan long before it was a worldwide phone thing.
Wow. Because this is from like 2002. I had no idea it was that old. I knew it was in Japan before it became a worldwide thing, but like 2002? Wow. That's
really since like 90s.
Well, that's a nightmare. Oh, this must be you finished them all. That's the last one.
Yes. He says, "I love walks," and in the middle is "Yoku dekimashita." Good job. Well, not congratulations, but you did well. You did great.
Would you like to continue to do well and great? No. Well, we've finished our typing lessons. I am now a Japanese typing expert. This was the mail between the family, right?
Yep, family mail. It said checking the mail at the start there. Did you type that like randomly? This is like random characters.
I was about to bear in mind that this is a used device. It's not like this was new in box, so these could very well be just what was already left there by the previous owner.
Unless this is another joke, which I doubt, that looks like garbage. Yomi Kono-chan, okay. Okay. Mefu Atsue.
This appears to be page 2 out of 5.
Yeah. Konnichiwa, kin medalu wo 10 mai wo motta nya ka? This is cute. Nyan tomo subarashii nya. Sono choushi de motto motto ganbatte nya from Nyanko. So from Nyanko, this is from Nyanko. Nyanko is like a traditional, very common, cute name for a cat because nyan is the sound for a meow. So Nyanko, little meow. I don't know what the title means. Mefu Atsue o. I'm not too sure. But the body, it sounds like these are like built in. They were talking about, did you get 10 medals? Keep trying. 10 gold medals.
Okay.
Almost. Yeah. This is definitely garbage. Suta nuhi mi so. Yeah, this one makes sense. Yeah. Konnichiwa.
Okay, so probably there was something built in, but these are like editable. So the previous owner went in and typed garbage into page 1, and
that's what it's looking like to me.
Yeah.
Reading in, reloading. This is the same.
This looks like the same message.
Yeah. Did you get 10 medals? Yeah.
Okay. So this is how you would leave messages for your family, I guess. Entertainment, music, painting, presumably.
Draw freely.
Okay. I assume this does say something about music.
Yeah, listen to music. Ensoul, I'm not sure about. That's what that means. Oh, musical performance, yeah. That's tarot, like fortune telling.
Oh, great. Well, let's go left to right as usual.
Yep.
Oh no.
Free and so free play, and Jido and so automatic play, and music game playing game, like music playing game.
Wow. Okay, I was not expecting that. Like this is this is a keyboard. It's not that kind of keyboard.
Oh, apparently it's gonna be now. Okay, ガイドをよく見て演奏してね。上手に曲を演奏できるかな? Okay, look closely at the guide and play. Play as in play the music, play an instrument. 上手に曲, can you play a song skillfully? Can you play a good song?
No, is the answer to that question. Oh dear. Is
there like a add-on?
There could be an add-on that I obviously don't have.
Yeah, I mean, it said look closely at the guide. I don't see a guide though. Chol. What does that say in the middle? Chol. Butterfly.
That might be the title of a song. Like maybe that's all that.
Good. Oh, yep, you're right. It's probably the title of the song. Oh, I see. Yeah.
I can't. It can't possibly be click. Oh no. Wait. Is there anything I can type on the keyboard that'll make it happy?
That suggests just that. I don't know.
Oh. Oh, okay. Okay, I got it.
By the way, the characters on it are the do, re, mi, like that's me.
Oh, okay.
Le. Yeah.
Well, this is the worst conceivable way to play a musical instrument. So it's just the bottom row of the keyboard is the white keys. That's all. It's not complicated, but it is terrible.
Yeah.
I want to finish this just so that it can give me a terrible score. I just want to, see if it actually gives you a score or something. I'm not sure what the goal of this is, because this is a learning system, and this does not learn you how to play the piano.
Purely within this system, I suppose, but that's it. Nothing useful.
Yeah, just a game. That's fine. It can just be a game. Yeah. Oops, dang it.
It's more like, I get the feeling all three of those options are the same thing. The first one was free play, the second one is automatically play a song, and the third one is, follow.
Yeah. That all follows. That makes sense. That was the exciting music mode. Let's draw. So this is going to be like coloring in.
Manga, paint manga, comics. And this is for making four panel comics in black and white. That is
how silly of me to imagine that it might just have drawing rather than specifically making manga.
Well, I mean, the word manga.
I'm sure there's a translational thing happening here.
Exactly, it's basically just a drawing. Okay.
Yeah.
自由に絵を描いたり, you can draw freely. You can draw with stamps, and you can also print. It says.
Too bad we don't have the printer for this thing. That would really improve the experience.
Yes.
Okay, we're gonna see how good my drawing skill is with this quality keyboard, or mouse rather, that I really can't make move at all. This is a circle. Trust me.
I'll believe it. You got a circle tool up there.
Oh, well, that's a fantastic point. This is actually a slightly better piece of software than I expected. But, why use a circle tool when you can just hand draw horribly?
Fair point.
We're going to go ahead and give our beautiful character here blue eyes with no whites of the eyes at all. None. It's got a pupil in there. And then just to really drive home the point, we're gonna have blood coming out of this eye. There we go. There's our beautiful drawing. I think it's very good. I would print it, but I don't have the printer.
Unfortunately. I believe those are the stamps on the right.
Yeah, they sure look stampy.
Hey, there's our guy Poach.
Yep, he's happy with this. Okay, we're just gonna build up a quick stack here. That is truly terrifying. I know that's supposed to be cutesy for children, but that is a nightmare from which I cannot awake.
Race car and.
But why? Why is he playing the guitar?
Well, no,
I mean, I guess because it's for kids is the answer to that question.
Yeah.
Doesn't seem like there's a way to save your drawing, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, that is strange.
Well, you can save it by printing it. It probably just actually doesn't have the space on the system to save it. It's probably not a lot more to it than that. Our dog friend has gotten in a terrible car eye incident. Oh, there we go. That's over. We'll put a cutesy heart in the corner. Hooray. Okay, well that was an experience. It saved, if nothing else, to the video recording.
There you go.